They didn't just take my seat, they erased my name. The gold-lettered chart outside the grand hall shimmered under the chandeliers, but my place had been pushed to the bottom, beside the swinging kitchen doors. I smiled as if it didn't matter, though every camera phone in the room was catching the scene. My husband avoided my eyes. My mother-in-law didn't bother hiding her smirk. The laughter from the main table was loud enough to drown my pulse. If they thought I would sit quietly in the shadows, they'd forgotten one thing. I had been planning for this moment all along. The limousine slowed to a graceful stop in front of the grand stone steps. I stepped out, the silk hem of my dress whispering against the polished leather of my heels, and was greeted by the blinding staccato of camera flashes. The air smelled faintly of roses and champagne. For a fleeting moment, I believed this would be a day to remember for the right reasons. A day I would finally feel like part of my husband's family. The Carter name carried weight in this city, but not because of me. I had earned my place in my own way, through glass and steel buildings that bore my design signature, through nights spent hunched over blueprints rather than gossiping at charity galas. Yet as I stood before the entrance of Ashwood Hall, a restored 19th century estate I had adored since childhood, it felt as though the world had aligned just for tonight. I had once sketched this building in the margins of my notebooks, imagining what it would be like to step inside as its owner. Instead, tonight it hosted my sister-in-law's wedding, and I was a guest. That was enough, I thought. Enough to be part of the family, enough to be accepted. The foyer glittered beneath a cascade of crystal chandeliers, the marble floors reflecting 100 tiny constellations. Just ahead, a gilded easel displayed the seating chart, each name inscribed in looping gold script. My eyes traveled down the list, anticipating my place near the bride and groom. It wasn't there. I scanned again, slower. There it was. My name. At the very bottom. Table 14, right beside the kitchen doors, far from the clink of champagne flutes and the laughter of the main hall. The ornate lettering did nothing to soften the sting. A hollow laugh escaped me before I could stop it. I looked toward my husband. He met my gaze for half a second, his jaw tightening, then turned away. No explanation, no defense. Just a man unwilling to make eye contact with the wife who had just been exiled in front of half the city. I straightened my back and crossed the hall, the faint hum of whispered conversations following me like a shadow. I could feel the subtle shift in the air, that blend of curiosity and quiet pity people reserve for public humiliations they don't want to admit they enjoy. Halfway to my assigned table, I heard them. "She's better suited to wiping tables than sitting at one," my mother-in-law said, her voice pitched low but not low enough. My sister-in-law's laugh followed, a light, satisfied sound. I didn't break stride. My heels clicked evenly against the marble, each step deliberate. But something inside me coiled tight, like a spring. As I passed the velvet ropes marking the entrance to the VIP section, a young staff member stepped into my path. "I'm sorry, ma'am. This area is for family only." The words stung more than I expected, mostly because I had worn the title family for nearly 7 years. I glanced past him, at the long table gleaming with crystal stemware, the bride radiant in the center, the groom leaning in to whisper something that made her blush. A phone camera lifted in my peripheral vision. Someone was recording. By the time I reached my assigned seat, the video was already making its way across the room, one phone screen after another lighting up with my humiliation. The comments started before I even unfolded my napkin. Smirking emojis, hashtags that stung, strangers speculating about my fall from grace. I smiled anyway, a practice smile, polite and unruffled, but my eyes, reflected in the polished silverware, told a different story. I had been underestimated before, dismissed, laughed at. Tonight they'd done all 3 in the span of 20 minutes, and as I sat there, the clatter of plates and the laughter from the main table filling the air, I felt the calm, cold certainty settle over me. They thought they'd put me in my place. They had no idea. I didn't flinch. I didn't rise from my seat, didn't demand an explanation, didn't storm toward the main table the way some guests clearly expected me to. Instead, I smoothed my napkin over my lap and took a slow sip of champagne, as though nothing in the world had shifted. That was what they would see, me beaten into polite submission. Let them think it. Under the table, my hand slipped into my clutch. The phone lit my face in a soft, almost reverent glow. With practiced ease, I opened an app whose icon was disguised as a weather widget. Inside, a single chat thread waited. 3 contacts, no names, just initials. The group title, Plan B. I had created it 6 months ago after an offhand comment from my mother-in-law about how appearances matter more than feelings. Something in her tone had been too deliberate, too amused. It made me wonder if she'd been rehearsing ways to humiliate me for years. So I prepared, not for a fight in the moment. That's messy, emotional, easily dismissed, but for the kind of strike that ends conversations permanently. My thumb hovered over the keyboard for only a second before I typed 2 words, execute now. The message sent, a silent bullet flying into the quiet war I'd been waging alone. As I waited, my mind wandered back to the day I met Michael Hughes, the owner of Ashwood Hall. The memory came in sharp fragments, the desperate note in his voice, the weight in his shoulders as he paced the empty ballroom. His family's historic estate was weeks from foreclosure. The bank had buyers lined up, buyers who intended to gut the place and turn it into luxury apartments. "You're the only one who can make it look like it did in the photos," he'd told me, handing over a stack of brittle sepia images. "I can pay you half your usual rate." I'd refused the money. "I don't want your cash, Michael. I want something else." "What?" "A promise," I'd said, "that one day, if I ever need it, you'll give me this building. Its keys, its name, its reputation, for 24 hours. No questions asked." He'd looked at me as though I were joking, but he'd agreed. That was 2 years ago. I'd all but forgotten about it, until tonight. Now, across the room, I caught sight of Michael stepping into the hall from a side door. His gaze swept over the crowd until it found me. We didn't smile, didn't wave, but I saw the subtle dip of his head, the signal. A minute later, the waitstaff at the VIP table began collecting glasses that were still half full. Plates vanished mid-bite. The bride looked around in confusion. The groom leaned toward a server, his voice tight. The explanation came in low, apologetic tones. "Temporary pause in service, sir. Venue management will address it shortly." They didn't know yet, but venue management was now me. I rose from my chair, quiet enough that only the woman beside me, an old college friend who'd married into this circle as awkwardly as I had, noticed. "Where are you going?" she whispered. "Just stretching my legs," I replied, my tone as casual as if I were headed for the powder room. The private office was on the 2nd floor behind a locked door. Michael was already there, a folder on the desk between us. "I can have legal finalize this in under 5 minutes, he said, tapping the paperwork. "Transfer of ownership, full rights, assets, and operational control." I scanned the pages, my pen gliding across signature lines with calm precision. 7 figures, wired directly from one of my less public accounts. My name appeared in bold type where his had been only minutes earlier. When the last document was signed, I placed the pen down slowly, feeling the strange mix of satisfaction and detachment settle in my chest. This wasn't revenge yet. This was foundation work, a stage, waiting for the curtain to rise. "You want me to make the announcement now?" Michael asked. I shook my head. "Not yet. Timing is everything." From the window, I could see the main hall below. My mother-in-law's posture was sharp with irritation, her hands fluttering towards servers as if she could command them back into motion. The guests were restless, murmuring. Phones glowed in every hand, more clips spreading online. The energy was shifting, uncertainty, confusion. I wanted to feed it, let it grow. Michael poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed one to me. "You've been waiting for this, haven't you?" "I've been preparing for it," I corrected. I left the office the way I'd entered, without fanfare, without anyone noticing. Back at my table, I sat once more, my expression placid, my hands steady. Around me, speculation rippled. Something was wrong with the service. Something was happening upstairs. No one looked at me twice. That was the beauty of underestimation. It gave you all the room you needed to move. And I was moving now. Every step calculated. The contract was in my possession. The building was mine. The only thing left was to choose the exact moment to let everyone else know, when it would hurt the most, when the story would spread farthest, when their smug little smiles would crack wide open. I took another sip of champagne, though the bubbles tasted different now. Sharper, sweeter. My friend leaned in. "You seem calmer," she said. I allowed the faintest smile. "I just remembered something important," I murmured. In truth, I was remembering many things. The way my mother-in-law's voice had curled around insults like they were gifts. The look in my husband's eyes when he'd chosen silence over defending me. The years of polite tolerance I'd endured at their table. Tonight, the table would change. I glanced toward the bride, radiant in her white gown, laughing at something the groom whispered in her ear. I wondered if she had any idea she was sitting in the middle of my property. Not yet, but soon. The clock ticked past 9. The toasts would begin soon, the speeches, the perfect window for a revelation that would make every phone in the room rise in unison. My fingers tapped the side of my glass. Not yet, I reminded myself. The best strikes are the ones they never see coming. And they still didn't see me at all. The first notes of a soft piano drifted through the hall, signaling the transition from dinner to speeches. I set my glass down, my fingers brushing the cool stem, and caught Michael's eye across the room. He gave the slightest nod. Showtime. The master of ceremonies, a man with a voice made for grand declarations, stepped forward. He smiled broadly, tapping the microphone until the soft chatter quieted. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "before we move on to toasts, we have a special announcement from Ashwood Hall itself." My mother-in-law leaned toward my husband, her lips forming the words, "What now?" "Tonight," the MC continued, "we welcome a new chapter in the legacy of this estate. Please join me in congratulating our new owner." The pause was deliberate, stretching just long enough for curiosity to sharpen. "Mrs. Emily Carter." For a heartbeat, the air seemed to still. Then every head turned toward me. The spotlights from the stage caught the shimmer of my dress, the arch of my brows, the calm smile I'd worn for the past hour. And then the screen behind the MC flickered to life. Footage rolled. Me, in jeans and a hard hat, standing in the gutted ballroom 2 years earlier. My hands traced the carved moldings. My voice, captured in an old interview, explaining the painstaking restoration process. Clips showed me side by side with artisans, overseeing every detail, bringing the hall back from ruin. Gasps echoed. A few claps began hesitantly, then grew louder. Phones lifted, the glow of live streaming blooming across the room. The same guests who'd smirked at my humiliation earlier now angled for the best shot of my triumph. In the streaming comments, the tone shifted. Queen move, Ari power play, emojis of crowns replacing the earlier sneers. From my seat, I scanned the main table. My mother-in-law's smile was brittle, her knuckles white around her champagne flute. My husband stood frozen, one hand in his pocket, the other gripping his phone as it buzzed relentlessly. His eyes darted from me to the crowd, as though calculating how quickly this would spread beyond the hall. The MC gestured toward me. "Mrs. Carter, would you care to say a few words?" I rose slowly, letting the rustle of my dress fill the pause. "Only that Ashwood Hall will continue to be a place where every guest is valued equally," I said, my gaze sweeping the room. "No one should ever feel they're sitting in the wrong seat." There were chuckles, Murmurs, a few knowing glances exchanged between guests. I stepped down from the spotlight without looking at the main table again. This wasn't about gloating, at least not yet. Instead, I turned toward the tables near the far wall, where the overflow guests sat. Old family friends, distant relatives, the ones too far down the pecking order for prime seating. I invited them, one by one, to join the newly expanded VIP section. Staff moved quickly, rearranging chairs and place settings under my quiet direction. Soon the long table was filled with fresh faces, laughter spilling into the air like champagne. It was the kind of move that looked gracious but carried its own blade. Every empty chair at the original VIP table was a visible reminder of who had been replaced. As I settled into my new place, surrounded by people smiling for the first time that night, my phone buzzed. I expected congratulations, maybe a photo from a friend already posted online. Instead, it was a text from an unknown number. "Don't trust your husband. He's not on your side." My fingers tightened around the phone. The message had no signature, no context, just that. I glanced toward the main table where my husband was speaking quietly into his phone, his posture stiff. My mother-in-law leaned in close, her hand on his arm, her expression a mix of urgency and calculation. I slid the phone back into my clutch, my smile unchanged. The celebration around me went on, but beneath the hum of voices and clink of glasses, I felt the temperature shift. This was no longer just a public victory. Something darker was moving beneath the surface, something that would demand a different kind of preparation. For now, I raised my glass to the guests around me, to the laughter I'd orchestrated, to the perfect photo op every phone in the room was capturing. The knife was still in my hand, but the game was far from over. The morning after the wedding, my inbox was a tidal wave of notifications. Articles, interview requests, photo tags. The story had spread like wildfire. The headlines were relentless. Bride's sister-in-law stuns guests with power move. Niece of society matriarch buys wedding venue mid-ceremony. Emily Carter rewrites the rules of family politics. But the one that pleased me most was from a women's advocacy magazine. She took the table back and made it bigger for everyone. By noon, I was seated in a sunlit cafe across from a local news anchor. The cameras were already rolling when she leaned forward. "Emily, can you tell our viewers why you did it?" I smiled, the kind of smile that invited trust. Ashwood Hall will now be a center for events that support women who've been overlooked, underestimated, or silenced, I said. No one should feel small in a room where they deserve to belong. It was the truth, and yet it was also strategy. A clear message, easy for the public to champion, impossible for my critics to attack without looking petty. By evening, the clip had been shared across every platform I could think of. The hashtag #SeatForEveryone trended for hours. People posted their own stories of exclusion, tagging me in photos of reunions, weddings, and corporate dinners where they'd been sidelined. The viral video from the wedding passed 5 million views in under 24 hours. I could feel the tide shifting completely in my favor, but tides, I'd learned, were never permanent. The first cracks appeared 2 days later. My assistant, Jenna, came into my office with a grim expression, holding her tablet like it might bite. "You should see this," she said. It was a blog post, already climbing the trending charts. The truth about Emily Carter's wedding stunt. The anonymous author accused me of using the incident as a calculated PR stunt to promote my architecture firm, suggesting the women's support mission was a convenient cover. Screenshots of my past projects were framed as proof that I'd profited from exclusivity, not inclusion. The tone was vicious, personal. It read less like investigative journalism and more like a hit piece. "Who wrote this?" I asked. Jenna hesitated. "The account traces back to someone named—" She stopped. "I don't know how to tell you this." "Say it." "It's registered to Daniel Carter." For a moment, the name didn't connect. And then it did. My husband. I sat back in my chair, the hum of the city outside my window fading into silence. The text from the unknown number at the wedding echoed in my head. Don't trust your husband. It was almost absurd. Almost. He'd stood there, watching my public victory unfold, and instead of joining the applause, he'd been sharpening a blade behind my back. The post had comments, hundreds of them. Some defended me, calling the blog a smear campaign. Others, predictably, believed every word. That was the danger of an open wound. Once you showed it to the world, someone was bound to press harder. My phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Daniel. No greeting, no preamble. We need to talk. I didn't respond. Not yet. Not until I decided whether I wanted to have that conversation in private or on camera. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of the blog began to hit the family. My mother-in-law's charity events were suddenly postponed after several sponsors withdrew. The bride and groom had to disable comments on their wedding photos. A cousin messaged me to say the family WhatsApp group was a war zone. This was what systematic destruction looked like: fast, messy, indiscriminate. I'd lit the match, but someone else was fanning the flames now. The irony was almost poetic. Daniel thought he could undercut my credibility, but in doing so, he'd confirmed everything I'd begun to suspect about where his loyalties truly lay. I closed the blog post and opened a new document on my laptop. It was time to rewrite the next act of this story, one that would make my husband wish he'd never tried to compete in a game I'd already mastered. For days, my name never left the headlines. Morning talk shows dissected my power play with panels of etiquette experts and social media strategists. Some called me an icon of female empowerment. Others accused me of sabotaging a family celebration for personal glory. Every time I opened my phone, I was greeted by a flood of hashtags, half of them celebratory, the other half poisonous. My assistant Jenna sent me daily analytics reports. Mentions are up 300%. She said one morning, sliding a tablet across my desk. Your following has doubled in a week. I stared at the graphs, numbers rising like a stock in free fall for everyone else but me. Yet the growth didn't feel like victory. It felt like exposure, the kind that leaves you with nowhere to hide. That afternoon, my sister-in-law appeared on a popular daytime show. I didn't watch it live, but the clips flooded my feed within minutes. She sat on a velvet couch, her makeup perfect, her voice trembling just enough to seem authentic. I know Emily didn't mean to ruin my day, she began, eyes shining under the studio lights, but that's what happened. I felt invisible at my own wedding. Everyone was talking about her, not us. It's like I became collateral damage in some vendetta. She pressed a tissue to her cheek, catching a tear just before it fell. The audience murmured sympathetically. The clip racked up views and the comments poured in. People who had celebrated me days ago now questioning whether I'd gone too far. For the first time since the wedding, I sat in silence and let the question take root. Had I crossed a line? My motives had been sharp and clear at the start, reclaiming dignity, standing against deliberate humiliation. But the collateral damage was real. And the optics, I knew how easily they could be turned against me. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window, the city lights scattering across the dark. My phone buzzed with a notification, not from the news this time, but from a private email account I barely used. The subject line was simple: proof. The attachment was a series of screenshots from a group chat. The names at the top stopped me cold. My husband, my mother-in-law, and two of her closest friends. The conversation began weeks before the wedding. They discussed seating arrangements, openly mocking the idea of me being near the main table. My mother-in-law wrote, "She thinks she's family. Time to remind her she's not." My husband's reply was worse. "The humiliation will push her to sign the divorce terms without a fight. She won't see it coming." They spoke casually about my worth in the settlement, about which assets I might cling to, and how to leverage my pride to strip them away. Every line was another blow, each one confirming that what I'd suspected was not only true, but premeditated. I read the thread twice before closing the file, my hands cold around the glass stem. When I confronted Daniel later that evening, he didn't deny it. He didn't even look ashamed. "You were never supposed to find out like this," he said flatly. "But it's out now, so let's be honest. We're done. We've been done for a long time." I waited for an explanation, something that would at least dress the wound in words, but what came next was sharper than any confession. "I'm in love with someone else," he said. "I wanted to clear the path before it got messy." The air seemed to thin, my ears filling with the rush of my own heartbeat. "Before what?" I asked, my voice steady despite the weight pressing against my ribs. "Before you made it complicated," he replied. You'd fight. You'd drag this out. I thought if you were humiliated, you'd just walk away." It was the arrogance in his tone that finally broke through the shock. He still thought I'd leave quietly. He still didn't understand that every time he underestimated me, he handed me another weapon. I set my glass down, the stem clicking against the table. "You planned to humiliate me into surrender," I said. "Instead, you handed me control of the one thing you can't take back." He frowned, unsure. "What's that?" "The story," I told him, "and now I decide how it ends." Daniel exhaled sharply, shaking his head like I was speaking in riddles. "You can't PR your way out of this forever." I almost smiled. "Watch me." Later, alone in the quiet of my office, I replayed every moment of the past week. The rise, the applause, the backlash, the betrayal laid bare. The view from the top had been intoxicating, but the fall was where you learned who you were. I opened my laptop and began drafting a statement, not the defensive, tearful apology my critics would expect, but something else entirely. This wouldn't be about winning Daniel back or silencing my sister-in-law. It would be about reclaiming the narrative before anyone else could write the ending for me. The price of power, I realized, wasn't just the enemies you made, it was the pieces of yourself you had to be willing to burn to keep your hands on the wheel. And I wasn't done driving yet. The pen felt heavier than it should have, its weight out of proportion to the single stroke it would take to end a marriage. Daniel sat across the table from me, flanked by his attorney, the same man who had likely helped draft the terms they'd once hoped I'd sign in shame. But the humiliation they'd counted on had never taken root, only resolve. I signed my name in one smooth motion. The papers slid across the polished wood to his side, where he glanced at them briefly before adding his own signature. No farewell, no handshake, just the quiet acknowledgement that this chapter, toxic and tangled, was closed. The settlement left him with his accounts, his apartment, and the hollow comfort of his new relationship. I kept Ashwood Hall. The venue wasn't just brick and stone, it was the battlefield where I had been underestimated, and the prize I'd claimed for refusing to stay in the shadows. For weeks after, I avoided the temptation to gloat. No leaked messages, no retaliatory interviews. The press wanted me to keep the feud alive, but I chose something else. Revenge had been my fuel, but it wasn't my destination. I began transforming the hall. The grand ballroom was restored to its full glory, the chandeliers polished until they scattered light like water. But the seating was my rebellion made permanent. A single, impossibly long banquet table stretched the length of the room, draped in white linen. Every seat identical, every guest visible. There was no main table now, no hierarchy. Our first event was a wedding for a young woman whose own family had refused to attend. She walked the aisle with friends at her side, her smile unshaken by the empty spaces where her relatives might have been. When she sat at that endless table, she looked around as though the room itself had embraced her. Word spread quickly. Couples began reaching out, not for grandeur or exclusivity, but for the promise that here they would never be treated as less than anyone else. I hosted charity galas for women starting over after divorce, community dinners for people who'd been excluded from their own celebrations. One evening, as the room buzzed with music and conversation, I stood at the far end of the table and watched the way strangers leaned toward each other, their voices mingling into one hum. No one was on the outside. No one had to crane their neck to be part of the moment. That was my victory. Not the headlines, not the likes, but this. Months later, I was invited to speak at a TED Talk. The stage was simple. A single red circle on the floor, the spotlight soft but unyielding. I told my story, not as a scandal, not as a feud, but as a lesson in reclaiming your seat when others try to take it from you. I spoke about the silent weapons we carry, preparation, patience, and the refusal to let someone else define our worth. I saw faces in the audience light up with recognition, with the quiet thrill of knowing they weren't alone in their battles. After the talk, messages flooded in, stories from women who'd left marriages that had ground them down, from men who'd been told they didn't belong at a certain table, from people who'd learned to build their own when none would have them. Daniel and my mother-in-law disappeared from my orbit entirely. No accidental encounters at galas, no whispers in the same social circles. It was as though they had been erased from the narrative. I didn't chase their absence, I let it be. One winter afternoon, as snow fell in slow, lazy spirals outside, I was preparing the hall for a community holiday dinner. I just finished checking the final place settings when a young woman stepped hesitantly into the doorway. She was alone, clutching a worn leather bag. "Can I help you?" I asked. Her eyes scanned the room, lingering on the white draped table, stretching endlessly forward. Then she walked toward me, her steps tentative but certain. When she reached me, she took my hand in both of hers, her grip warm and steady. "You just saved my life," she said. There was no explanation, no backstory. She didn't need one. I understood. I led her to the table, choosing a seat where she could see everyone and be seen in return. She smiled, a small thing but real. The kind of smile that told me this place, this vision, had become more than my redemption. It was a refuge. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the table was full.